There's a white powder in your kitchen right now that's killed more people than most wars you've studied in school. It's in your coffee. It's in your bread. It's in foods you'd never suspect. Ketchup, salad dressing, pasta sauce. A single can of soda contains 10 teaspoons of it. And every second you've been alive, someone somewhere has been consuming it without thinking twice. This powder was once so rare and expensive that only kings could afford it. Medieval banquets displayed sculptures made from it, swans, castles, entire scenes crafted in white to show wealth. Then Europeans discovered they could grow it in tropical colonies, and they built a machine to produce it at scale. That machine ran on human bodies, millions of them, enslaved Africans, working themselves to death in Caribbean heat, their average lifespan after arrival, 7 to 9 years. The lifespan of an enslaved sugar worker was shorter than most prison sentences today. The empires that powder built, British, French, Dutch, grew rich beyond measure. The bodies it consumed were counted, catalogued, and replaced like parts in a factory, because that's exactly what they were. Parts. Expendable, profitable. And when the ships finally stopped carrying chains, the sugar kept flowing. Only now it flows into supermarkets and fast food and processed everything, quietly helping to kill 38 million people a year from non-communicable diseases. Diabetes, heart disease, obesity. Same powder, different methods, still deadly. If you're here because you want to understand how one substance transformed from medieval luxury into plantation nightmare, into modern epidemic, stay with me. And if this is the kind of story you think needs telling, the kind that doesn't look away from what sweetness actually costs, subscribing helps me keep telling them. This is the story of sugar, how it built empires, how it broke bodies, and how it never stopped. Picture a banquet hall in 15th century England. Torchlight flickers off stone walls. Lords and ladies in velvet and fur gather around tables laden with roasted meats and exotic spices. And at the head table, the centerpiece that everyone whispers about, a sculpture. Not carved from wood or stone, but molded entirely from sugar. A white swan, intricate and gleaming, worth more than most people in that room will earn in their lifetimes. This is sugar as status symbol, sugar as power made visible. Because in medieval Europe, sweetness comes mostly from honey, from beehives tended by peasants, from orchards growing apples and pears. Sugar is something different, imported in tiny quantities from distant lands, so expensive that only the wealthiest can afford it, so rare that it's used as medicine, as spice, as currency, as proof that you matter in a world where most people don't. The sugar reaching medieval Europe comes from places most Europeans will never see: Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Sicily, Cyprus, Crete. These are the edges of the Islamic world where sugarcane has been cultivated for centuries, where the knowledge of growing and processing it has been refined into something almost industrial. Sugarcane is a tropical grass native to New Guinea and Southeast Asia, but by medieval times it spread west through trade routes, carried by merchants and conquerors who understand its value. Growing sugarcane isn't simple farming. The plant needs specific conditions: tropical or subtropical climate, lots of water, lots of labor. And turning raw cane into crystallized sugar requires knowledge, equipment, and more labor still. You cut the cane, you crush it to extract juice. You boil the juice in a series of vessels, each time removing impurities and concentrating the liquid until sugar crystals form. It's hot, dangerous work. Burns are common. The process runs day and night because cane juice spoils quickly. If you don't process it fast, you lose everything. The early sugar operations in the Mediterranean aren't plantations in the sense we'll come to know them, but they're moving in that direction. In Sicily under Norman rule, in Cyprus under Venetian control, estates are being organized specifically around sugar production. Labor is increasingly coerced. Prisoners of war, enslaved people from various conflicts, workers bound to the land and the harvest. This is where the model begins, the template that will eventually be perfected in blood across the Atlantic. But in medieval Europe, most people never taste pure sugar. A wealthy merchant might use it in medicine or to show off at special occasions. A monastery might keep a small supply for Easter celebrations. The average peasant lives and dies without ever knowing the taste that will one day become so common, it's unavoidable. That starts to change in the 15th century, when the age of exploration brings Europeans to new lands and new opportunities. The Portuguese, pushing down the coast of Africa and out into the Atlantic, start establishing sugar operations on islands they claim: Madeira, São Tomé, the Canary Islands, Cape Verde. These aren't just trading posts, these are experiments in something darker, using enslaved African labor to grow sugarcane at industrial scale on land stolen or claimed through conquest. Madeira becomes particularly important. The Portuguese clear the island's forests, burning so much wood that, according to some accounts, the fires burn for years, and plant sugarcane across the cleared land. They bring in enslaved people from Africa and the Canary Islands to work the fields and mills. And it works. Sugar production explodes relative to what the Mediterranean islands were producing. Prices start dropping, demand starts rising. European appetite for sweetness grows as supply increases. By 1500, Madeira is producing thousands of tons of sugar annually. The island is being transformed into a monocrop economy, its entire purpose reduced to feeding European sweet teeth. And the Portuguese are learning lessons that will scale across an ocean: how to organize labor, how to maximize extraction from both land and workers, how to build mills that can process vast quantities of cane, how to structure an economy around a single export crop. Then they look west, to Brazil, to the vast territory they're claiming in South America. And they bring sugarcane with them. The plant thrives in Brazil's tropical climate. The land seems endless. And the Portuguese already know how to build the machinery of extraction. They just need to scale it up. By the mid-1500s, Brazil is becoming the world's primary sugar producer. The Portuguese are establishing massive estates along the coast, engenhos they call them, each one a combination of farmland, mill, and forced labor camp. They're enslaving indigenous people first, but disease and resistance and sheer mortality mean the indigenous population can't sustain the scale of labor the sugar machine demands. So they turn to Africa, to the slave trade that's already been established for other purposes, and they industrialize it. Ships leave Portuguese ports loaded with trade goods, textiles, weapons, tools. They sail to West African coasts, trade those goods for enslaved people captured in wars or raids or kidnapped outright. They pack those people into holds like cargo, sail across the Atlantic in conditions so horrific that 15 to 25% die during the voyage. The ones who survive land in Brazil and are marched to the engenhos, where their lives become measured in how much sugar they can produce before they die. This is the prototype, Brazil is where the Atlantic sugar machine is assembled and tested. And it works. Works so well that other European powers see the profits and want in. The British look at the Caribbean, the French look at the Caribbean, the Dutch look at the Caribbean, and they see islands perfect for sugar, islands that can be conquered or claimed, islands close enough to European markets and West African slave ports to make the economics work. What the Portuguese proved in Brazil, the British and French will perfect in the Caribbean. They'll take the model, enslaved labor, monocrop production, industrial processing, and they'll refine it into something even more brutal, more efficient, more profitable, and more deadly than anything Brazil accomplished. The age of the sugar islands is about to begin, and the bodies are about to pile up. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, Martinique, Antigua, Trinidad, small islands in the Caribbean that most Europeans couldn't locate on a map, become the economic engines of empire. And they become death machines. Let's be specific about what happens when the British and French turn these islands into sugar factories, because the scale and the brutality need to be understood clearly. This isn't farming in any traditional sense. This is industrial extraction using human bodies as the primary resource. Start with the demographics, because the numbers tell a story that words sometimes can't capture. On some Caribbean sugar islands, by the 18th century, enslaved Africans make up 80 to 90% of the total population. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue. These places have been transformed into majority enslaved societies, where a tiny white planter class rules over massive populations of enslaved people through terror, violence, and the knowledge that profitability requires constant replacement of the labor force. Why constant replacement? Because enslaved people on Caribbean sugar plantations die. They die at rates that make the islands death traps. The average working life of an enslaved person on a sugar plantation is less than 5 years. Let me repeat that. 5 years. Between 25 and 50% of newly arrived enslaved people die within 3 years of landing on the islands. Some estimates for Jamaica in the early 19th century show mortality rates of 35 deaths per 1,000 enslaved people annually on sugar plantations. And that's during peacetime, in the later period when conditions had supposedly improved. The death rate is so high that Caribbean sugar colonies cannot sustain their enslaved populations through births. Unlike the American South, where enslaved populations eventually become self-reproducing, Caribbean sugar islands require constant imports of new enslaved people from Africa to replace the ones who die. This isn't an accident or a failure of the system. It's the system working as designed. It's cheaper to work people to death and replace them than to keep them alive long term. Let's follow an enslaved person's journey to understand why. You survive the Middle Passage. You're one of the 75 to 85% who doesn't die on the ship. You land on an island, disoriented, traumatized, sick from the voyage. You're sold at auction to a plantation owner, and you're immediately thrown into work that will break your body. Sugar cultivation is year-round, but follows a seasonal intensity. Planting season means clearing land, digging holes in hard tropical soil, planting cane cuttings in the brutal heat. The cane takes 12 to 18 months to mature. During that time, you're weeding, fertilizing, watching for pests, maintaining the fields. It's hard labor, but manageable. Then comes harvest, and harvest is hell. Sugarcane must be cut by hand with machetes. You're bent over in fields under Caribbean sun, cutting cane that grows taller than a person, thick stalks that dull your blade, work that tears at your hands and back. And it's not just cutting. You're also gathering the cane, loading it onto carts, transporting it to the mill. Everything is manual. Everything is urgent because once cut, cane starts losing sugar content. The clock is always running. At the mill, the work is even more dangerous. The cane needs to be crushed to extract juice, and that means feeding stalks into crushing rollers powered by water wheels or windmills, or more commonly, by animals or by enslaved people themselves turning the machinery. Workers feed cane into the rollers hour after hour. If you're tired, if you slip, if you don't pull your hand back fast enough, the rollers catch your fingers, your hand, your arm. Plantation records mention this kind of injury casually. Enslaved people losing limbs to the machinery, either dying from the injury or surviving maimed and less valuable. The extracted juice goes to the boiling house, and this is where things get truly hellish. Sugar juice has to be boiled in a series of large copper or iron vessels, sometimes 5 or 6 cauldrons in succession, each one hotter than the last. The final vessels reach temperatures that can cause horrific burns if you're splashed. And you're standing over these boiling cauldrons for hours, ladling juice from one vessel to the next, skimming impurities, managing fires underneath that have to burn constantly. The heat is unbearable. The danger is constant. Burns are so common, they're not even recorded unless they're fatal or disabling. And this work runs 24 hours a day during harvest. Shifts might be 16 or 18 hours with minimal breaks. You work until you collapse, and if you collapse, you're punished for laziness. Overseers with whips patrol constantly. Any perceived slowness, any mistake, any moment of rest brings the whip down on your back. Scars accumulate. Everyone who survives carries them. The punishment system is designed for terror. Whipping is routine. Dozens of lashes for minor offenses. For serious infractions, like attempting escape or striking an overseer, punishments escalate to torture. Being placed in iron collars with spikes, having limbs broken, being burned, being hanged as an example to others. Thomas Thistlewood's diary from Jamaica, which survives and has been studied by historians, documents casual, routine violence that's so extreme it's difficult to read. Torture as entertainment, rape as assertion of power, murder as discipline. Women face everything men face, plus systematic sexual violence. Plantation owners, overseers, and white workers all have near total power over enslaved women's bodies. Resistance means punishment. Submission doesn't guarantee safety. Children are born from these rapes, and under the law of partus sequitur ventrem, the child follows the condition of the mother. Those children are enslaved from birth, adding to the plantation's property. Malnutrition is constant. Enslaved people are fed minimal rations designed to keep them working, not healthy. They're given plots to grow their own food in whatever time they can spare from sugar work, which means Sunday or night hours after 16-hour shifts. Protein is scarce. Diseases of malnutrition, beriberi, pellagra, anemia, are common. Disease generally is everywhere. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, typhoid, smallpox. The Caribbean's tropical climate breeds disease, and enslaved people living in crowded, unsanitary quarters with inadequate food and brutal work schedules are perfectly vulnerable. Plantation hospitals exist, but they're usually just places where people go to die, with minimal medical care and no real treatment for the conditions that are killing them. And if you get pregnant while enslaved, research from burial grounds like Newton Plantation in Barbados shows that enslaved women face extreme stress, malnutrition during pregnancy, and complications that lead to high infant mortality, possibly 50% or higher. Babies die, mothers die, and the plantation replaces them by buying new enslaved people from the next ship. Now scale this up across the Caribbean. Hundreds of plantations on each major island, tens of thousands of enslaved people per island, multiple islands producing sugar for European markets. The system processes human beings as fuel for sweetness. The profits are enormous. Sugar becomes the single most valuable commodity in Atlantic trade. Plantation owners become spectacularly wealthy. So wealthy that many don't even live on their plantations, but install managers and return to Britain or France to live on their profits like aristocrats. Some of Britain's great estates, its political families, its financial institutions, have origins in Caribbean sugar and slavery. Glasgow, Liverpool, Bristol. These cities grow rich on sugar and slavery. And the system works so well, generates so much profit, that it doesn't matter how many people die. When an enslaved person becomes too weak or sick to work effectively, you sell them cheap to a smaller plantation or you let them die. Then you buy a replacement from the next slave ship. The economics favor this churn because keeping people alive long-term costs more than replacing them. By the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue, the French colony that will become Haiti, is the most profitable colony in the world, producing more sugar than all British Caribbean islands combined. It's also a powder keg, where enslaved people outnumber free people by more than 10 to 1, where brutality has been pushed beyond even Caribbean norms, where the system's contradictions, human beings treated as property, conscious beings tortured into productivity, will finally explode. That explosion comes in 1791. The Haitian Revolution begins. Enslaved people across Saint-Domingue rise in coordinated rebellion, kill their masters, burn the plantations, and fight a war for freedom that lasts over a decade. They win, the only successful slave revolt in history that creates an independent nation. And in winning, they destroy Saint-Domingue's sugar economy so completely it never recovers. But sugar itself doesn't end with Haiti. Cuba takes over as the Caribbean's sugar giant. Brazil continues producing. And new systems of exploitation emerge. Inden, toured labor from India and China, workers trapped by debt rather than chains, but still coerced into growing sugar. The methods change, the product remains, and Europe's appetite only grows. Because by the time Haiti burns, Europe is deeply addicted. Millions of people across Britain and France have incorporated sugar into daily life. It's no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. And that addiction was deliberately created. Let's talk about how sugar stopped being something rich people showed off and became something ordinary people couldn't live without. Because this transformation from rare spice to daily necessity is how sugar went from profitable to absolutely central to European empires and their economies. In 1700, the average British person consumes about 4 pounds of sugar per year. By 1800, it's 18 pounds. By 1900, it's 90 pounds. This isn't accidental. This is systematic creation of mass demand through cultural shifts, economic forces, and deliberate marketing by everyone profiting from sugar trade. The transformation happens through 3 colonial products that converge in European cups and create new rituals of consumption. Tea from China, coffee from Arabia, and later the Americas, and chocolate from Mesoamerica. None of these are naturally sweet. All of them become vehicles for sugar consumption. Start with tea, because tea's story is uniquely British and uniquely important. The British East India Company begins importing tea from China in the 17th century. Initially, it's expensive and rare, consumed by the wealthy who can afford both the tea and the sugar to sweeten it. But as Caribbean sugar production ramps up and prices fall, and as tea imports grow, something fundamental shifts in British culture. Tea becomes democratic. By the mid-18th century, working-class families are drinking tea. By the 19th century, tea breaks are built into factory schedules. Multiple times per day, British workers stop for tea. And tea in Britain means tea with sugar. Often lots of sugar, multiple teaspoons per cup. Cups consumed throughout the day. The scale of soft drink consumption by the late 20th and early 21st centuries is staggering. Americans in the early 2000s consume an average of over 50 gallons of soft drinks per person per year. That's about 52 pounds of sugar just from soda, not counting sugar in food. And it's not just America. Coca-Cola and Pepsi expand globally, bringing sugar water consumption to countries where it was previously minimal. This serves several functions at once. For workers, sweetened tea provides quick calories and caffeine that help them endure long factory shifts on minimal food. For factory owners, tea breaks keep workers productive without having to pay them enough for substantial meals. For the British Empire, this creates a market that consumes massive quantities of two colonial products, tea from China, later from British India, and sugar from the Caribbean. The economic historians have calculated that sugar by the 18th century might constitute 20% or more of the calories in the diet of the British urban poor. Not because they're eating candy, because they're drinking sugared tea, eating jam made cheaply from sugar and fruit, consuming bread from bakeries that use sugar, eating porridge sweetened with sugar or treacle, a syrup made from sugar production. Sugar has become a cheap source of calories that makes inadequate wages slightly more survivable. There's something almost diabolical about this system's elegance. Caribbean plantations using enslaved labor produce sugar cheaply. That cheap sugar allows British industrial workers to survive on lower wages. Those lower wages keep British manufacturing competitive. The profits from sugar and from industrial exports flow back to the merchant and planter classes. Everyone in power benefits. Everyone actually producing the value. Enslaved sugar workers in Jamaica, industrial workers in Manchester, is exploited. And it's not just Britain. France developed similar patterns with coffee and sugar. French workers drink coffee with sugar, consume sweetened products, incorporate sugar into daily caloric intake. The Netherlands does the same. Spain, Portugal, wherever sugar is available, consumption grows as prices fall. Rum adds another dimension to this story. Rum is distilled from molasses, the byproduct of sugar production. Caribbean plantations produce rum as a way to monetize what would otherwise be waste, and rum becomes part of the Atlantic economy in multiple ways. It's given to enslaved people as part of their rations, cheap, stupefying, making brutal conditions slightly more bearable. It's used in the slave trade itself. Rum is one of the goods traded for enslaved people in West Africa. It's consumed by sailors on slave ships and merchant vessels. It's drunk in taverns across Europe and the Americas. So sugar isn't just sugar. It's also the rum trade, also the molasses trade, also the economic engine connecting three continents in a triangle of extraction. Europe provides manufactured goods and ships. Africa provides enslaved people. The Americas provide sugar, rum, cotton, tobacco. And the wealth flows primarily one direction, toward European merchants, investors, and states. Some of Britain's most important financial institutions have sugar origins. Sugar merchants become so wealthy, they need ways to invest and store their profits, so they help establish banks. They need insurance for their ships and cargoes, so they help create the Lloyd's insurance market. They need to finance their operations, so they're involved in developing credit instruments and joint stock companies. The infrastructure of modern capitalism, banks, insurance companies, stock markets, all develop partly to serve the needs of the sugar trade. And through all of this, opposition to slavery is building, but slowly and against enormous economic interests. The Quakers are among the first religious groups to denounce slavery as immoral. By the late 18th century, an organized abolitionist movement emerges in Britain, led by people like William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved man whose autobiography exposes slavery's horrors. The movement gains momentum through decades of campaigning, petitioning Parliament, distributing pamphlets, organizing boycotts of slave-produced sugar. The famous image of an enslaved person in chains asking, "Am I not a man and a brother?" becomes the abolitionist symbol. Sugar boycotts become political acts. Refusing to consume slave-produced sugar is marketed as moral consumption, as using purchasing power for justice. But what actually ends the British slave trade in 1807 and slavery in British colonies in 1833 is a complex mix of moral arguments, slave resistance, and rebellions that make slavery increasingly expensive to maintain, and economic factors, including the fact that sugar production is moving to places like Cuba and Brazil, where slavery continues, meaning British planters are competing against slave labor anyway. When emancipation finally comes, it's on terms that favor slave owners, not enslaved people. The British government compensates slave owners for their property loss, paying out roughly £20 million, equivalent to billions today, in compensation. The enslaved people receive nothing, and they're often forced into apprenticeship systems that are slavery by another name for several years before they achieve actual freedom. And even after legal slavery ends, the need for sugar labor doesn't, so the system evolves. Plantations in the Caribbean and elsewhere start importing indentured laborers from India, China, Java. These workers are nominally free. They sign contracts. They're supposed to receive wages. They're supposed to be able to leave after their contract term. But in practice, they're trapped by debt, by isolation, by systems designed to keep them working until they die or become useless. Same plantations, different legal status for the workers, same sugar reaching European tables. By the early 20th century, sugar is fully integrated into Western diets. It's in everything. The British and Americans consume sugar like it's a nutrient rather than a luxury. Per capita consumption keeps rising. And then something changes in how sugar is consumed. It stops being something you add yourself and starts being something that's added for you, hidden in foods you don't think of as sweet. The age of industrial food processing is beginning, and sugar is about to disappear from view while becoming more dangerous than ever. The 20th century does something to sugar that's almost as transformative as the plantation system. It makes sugar invisible. And in making it invisible, it makes it inescapable. Picture an American or European supermarket in 1950, then 2000, then today. The changes tell the entire story. In 1950, sugar is something you mostly add yourself. You put it in coffee, you bake cakes from scratch with sugar you measure out. You see what you're consuming. By 2000, sugar is hidden inside almost everything on the shelves, in quantities that would shock you if you thought about it, in products that don't even taste particularly sweet. This transformation happens through the rise of ultra-processed foods, industrial products that are designed in laboratories and factories rather than kitchens, engineered for maximum shelf life and maximum profit and maximum compulsion to keep consuming. And sugar is the key ingredient that makes this system work. Start with the technology. In the early 20th century, the food processing industry figures out how to manufacture products at massive scale using refined ingredients, chemical additives, and industrial equipment. Refined white sugar is perfect for this system. It's cheap thanks to centuries of production infrastructure. It's chemically pure and consistent. It's shelf-stable. And it has properties that go beyond just sweetness. Sugar adds bulk to products. It affects texture, making food soft or crispy, depending on how it's used. It enhances flavor in ways that go beyond sweet. It can make salty foods taste better, make tomato sauce taste richer, make bread seem fresher. And crucially, sugar triggers reward pathways in the brain similar to addictive drugs. When combined with fat and salt in the right ratios, sugar creates foods that are almost impossible to stop eating. Food scientists discover they can engineer products to hit what they call the bliss point, the exact combination of sugar, fat, and salt that maximizes pleasure and desire to consume more. They test this rigorously, running trials with hundreds of subjects to find the precise formulation that makes people want to keep eating past satiety. And then they manufacture those formulations at industrial scale. Breakfast cereals are an early example. Originally marketed as health foods in the early 20th century, cereals evolve into sugar delivery systems for children. Kids' cereals by mid-century are sometimes over 40% sugar by weight. They're advertised directly to children on television, creating brand loyalty before kids can even understand they're being marketed to. Parents buy them because kids demand them, and because the marketing implies they're wholesome breakfast options. Soft drinks become another vector for sugar overconsumption. Coca-Cola and Pepsi, originally niche products, become global empires in the 20th century. A single can of regular Coke contains about 39 grams of sugar. That's about 10 teaspoons. People drink multiple cans per day without thinking about it as eating 10 or 20 or 30 teaspoons of sugar because it's liquid, it goes down easy, and it's marketed as refreshment rather than dessert. The scale of soft drink consumption by the late 20th and early 21st centuries is staggering. Americans in the early 2000s consume an average of over 50 gallons of soft drinks per person per year. That's about 52 pounds of sugar just from soda, not counting sugar in food. And it's not just America. Coca-Cola and Pepsi expand globally, bringing sugar water consumption to countries where it was previously minimal. But soft drinks and obvious sweets are only part of the story. The real insidiousness comes from sugar being added to products where consumers don't expect it. A tablespoon of ketchup contains about 4 grams of sugar, a full teaspoon. Pasta sauce, which should be tomatoes and spices, often contains added sugar. Bread contains sugar. salad dressing contains sugar. Yogurt, marketed as healthy, contains as much sugar as ice cream. Protein bars contain sugar. Low-fat products often replace fat with sugar to maintain flavor. High-fructose corn syrup, HFCS, accelerates this trend in the United States starting in the 1970s. Corn subsidies make HFCS cheaper than cane or beet sugar, and food manufacturers switch to using it in almost everything. The result is that sugar consumption increases, not because Americans are deliberately eating more dessert, but because sugar is hiding in every processed product they consume throughout the day. Current research suggests that ultra-processed foods, products that are industrially formulated from refined ingredients and additives, now make up 50 to 70% of energy intake in high-income countries. These products are deliberately engineered to be hyper-palatable, to override natural satiety signals, to make you eat more than you need. And sugar is central to that engineering. The companies producing these products know exactly what they're doing. Internal documents from food companies, revealed through investigations and lawsuits, show they understood the addictive properties of their formulations. They knew that children exposed early to high-sugar products would become lifelong consumers. They knew that reformulating to reduce sugar would reduce sales because the products would be less compulsive. So they kept the sugar levels high and spent billions on marketing to make overconsumption seem normal. By the 21st century, we've created a food environment where avoiding sugar requires active effort, nutritional knowledge, and often more money, because whole foods are frequently more expensive than processed products. Poor communities especially are flooded with cheap, sugar-laden processed foods, while fresh produce is scarce or expensive. Food deserts in urban areas mean corner stores stock soda and chips, but not vegetables. And the marketing never stops. Food companies spend hundreds of billions globally on advertising that associates their products with happiness, social connection, childhood joy, and anything except what they actually are. Industrial chemical mixtures designed to extract profit by triggering overconsumption. But unlike the plantation era, where the costs of sugar were borne by enslaved people far from consumers, the costs of modern sugar are borne by consumers themselves. The bodies breaking now aren't in Caribbean cane fields. They're in clinics getting diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, in hospitals getting treated for heart disease, in morgues decades younger than they should be. The death machine never stopped running. It just relocated, and the scale of what it's doing now makes the plantation era look small. Here are the numbers. Pay attention because they're about to get worse every year you're alive. In 2014, the World Health Organization estimated 422 million adults had diabetes worldwide. The International Diabetes Federation's latest projections estimate that by 2050, just 25 years from now, 853 million adults will have diabetes. That's about 1 in 8 adults globally. And the majority of those cases are type 2 diabetes, which is directly linked to diet, sugar consumption, and obesity. Obesity itself has become a global epidemic. Over 59% of adults in Europe are overweight or obese. In the United States, the numbers are even worse. Over 70% of adults are overweight, with over 40% classified as obese. And these aren't just statistics. These are people whose bodies are breaking down under conditions that didn't exist at this scale a generation ago. Diabetes is particularly cruel because it's a slow-motion catastrophe. You don't just get diagnosed and die. You get diagnosed and then spend years or decades managing a disease that affects almost every system in your body. Your blood sugar is dysregulated, which means chronic elevated glucose levels damage blood vessels, nerves, organs. Diabetes increases your risk of heart disease and stroke by 2 to 3 times. It's the leading cause of kidney failure, diabetic nephropathy, where kidney function gradually declines until you need dialysis or transplant. It's the leading cause of non-traumatic lower limb amputations because high blood sugar damages circulation and nerves in the feet and legs, leading to infections that won't heal and tissue death. It's a major cause of blindness from diabetic retinopathy, where blood vessels in the eyes are damaged. It causes nerve damage throughout the body, diabetic neuropathy that creates pain, numbness, digestive problems, sexual dysfunction. Managing diabetes means testing blood sugar multiple times daily, taking medications, often insulin injections several times a day, monitoring diet obsessively, dealing with a healthcare system that's often poorly equipped to provide adequate support, and living with the knowledge that even with good management, complications are likely over time. And it's expensive. In the United States, diabetes costs are estimated at over $400 billion annually, including direct medical costs and lost productivity. Globally, the economic burden runs into trillions. These costs fall on individuals who can't afford their insulin, on families bankrupted by medical bills, on healthcare systems overwhelmed by chronic disease management. Now, here's where it connects directly to sugar. The research is clear that high intake of added sugars, especially in sugar-sweetened beverages, is strongly linked to weight gain, obesity, and type 2 diabetes risk. Multiple large-scale studies have shown that people who consume more sugary drinks have significantly higher rates of type 2 diabetes, even after controlling for other factors like overall calorie intake and body weight. The mechanism isn't complicated. When you consume large amounts of sugar, especially liquid sugar that's absorbed quickly, you spike your blood glucose. Your pancreas responds by releasing insulin to move that glucose out of your blood and into cells. Over years of this pattern, repeated glucose spikes, repeated insulin surges, your cells become less responsive to insulin. This is called insulin resistance. Your pancreas has to produce more and more insulin to achieve the same effect. Eventually, your pancreas can't keep up, blood sugar stays elevated, and you have type 2 diabetes. Excess sugar consumption also drives fat accumulation, particularly visceral fat around organs, which is metabolically active and contributes to insulin resistance and inflammation. The combination of high sugar intake, processed food consumption, and sedentary lifestyles creates a perfect storm for metabolic disease. The World Health Organization, recognizing the crisis, issued guidelines in 2015 recommending that adults and children reduce their intake of free sugars to less than 10% of total energy intake, ideally below 5%, which is about 25 grams or 6 teaspoons per day for adults. Remember, that can of Coke has 39 grams of sugar. One can exceeds the daily recommended limit. But here's the problem. We are nowhere close to meeting those guidelines in most high-income countries. In the UK, adults consume 12 to 15% of calories from free sugars on average. In the United States, it's even higher. Children often consume far more. Some studies show kids getting 15 to 20% of calories from added sugars. And the distribution of this harm isn't random. Just like the plantation system concentrated suffering on enslaved Africans while enriching Europeans, the modern sugar epidemic hits hardest in communities with the least power to resist it. Poor neighborhoods have fewer supermarkets with fresh produce and more convenience stores selling processed foods. Marketing for junk food is concentrated in poor communities and communities of color. Fast food chains cluster in low-income areas. Schools in poor districts often have vending machine contracts and sell soda and candy to fund programs that inadequate public funding doesn't cover. The result is that diabetes and obesity rates are highest in the populations that are already most vulnerable. Racial minorities in wealthy countries, poor people everywhere, people living in food deserts without access to alternatives. And unlike the plantation system, where the victims could clearly identify who was exploiting them, the modern system diffuses responsibility so thoroughly that it's almost invisible. Who's responsible when a 10-year-old develops type 2 diabetes? The parents who couldn't afford better food or didn't know better. The schools that serve processed lunches and sell soda. The food companies that engineered hyper-palatable products designed to create overconsumption. The governments that subsidize corn and sugar production while not subsidizing vegetables. The advertising industry that targets children with junk food marketing. The economic system that keeps families poor and stressed with no time to cook from scratch. Everyone points to someone else. The food industry says it's personal responsibility. People should make better choices. Public health advocates say it's corporate malfeasance and predatory marketing. Government officials say they can't intervene without being accused of creating a nanny state. And meanwhile, the diabetes numbers keep climbing, the obesity rates keep rising, and the people getting sick are disproportionately the same people who've always paid the highest costs in every system, the poor and the powerless. There's also a global dimension that mirrors colonialism almost perfectly. As ultra-processed foods manufactured by American and European companies expand into developing countries, they bring the same health crisis with them. Mexico now has higher obesity rates than the United States, and soft drink consumption there is massive. Coca-Cola has saturated the Mexican market so thoroughly that in some rural areas, Coke is easier to access than clean water. Type 2 diabetes in Mexico has exploded. The life expectancy gains Mexico achieved in the late 20th century are being reversed by diet-related disease. The same pattern repeats across the global south. China, India, Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, the Middle East. Anywhere ultra-processed foods and sugary drinks expand, diabetes and obesity follow within a generation. The WHO estimates that by 2050, 3/4 of diabetes cases will be in low and middle-income countries. These are countries where healthcare systems are already strained and where most people can't afford diabetes management. The human cost will be staggering, and sugar companies know this. Leaked documents and investigative reporting have revealed that companies like Coca-Cola and food manufacturers have known for decades about sugar's role in obesity and diabetes. They've funded research designed to muddy the science and shift blame to lack of exercise or fat consumption instead of sugar. They've lobbied against public health measures like soda taxes and warning labels. They've marketed aggressively in countries with weak consumer protection laws. They've behaved exactly like tobacco companies did, prioritizing profit over health while hiding behind claims about personal choice and freedom. Some governments are starting to push back. Mexico, Chile, the UK, several other countries have implemented taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages. Some have mandated warning labels on products high in sugar, fat, or salt. Some have restricted junk food marketing to children. And these measures are showing results. Soda consumption drops when it's taxed. Healthier choices increase when products are clearly labeled. Children consume less junk food when marketing is restricted. But the food industry fights these measures with the same intensity and the same tactics that tobacco used. They fund front groups to argue that taxes hurt the poor, ignoring that diabetes also hurts the poor. They threaten to move jobs if regulation passes. They lobby politicians who depend on their campaign contributions. They sue governments that implement strong regulations. And they keep manufacturing and marketing products they know are driving a global health crisis. In 2024 and 2025, there's been a new development that echoes tobacco litigation. Lawsuits targeting ultra-processed food companies. San Francisco's city attorney filed suit against companies claiming their products are designed to be addictive, particularly to children, and cause preventable disease. The suits allege deliberate engineering to maximize consumption, fraudulent marketing that misleads consumers about health impacts, and failure to warn about addiction and disease risks. Whether these suits succeed remains to be seen. Tobacco litigation took decades and massive amounts of evidence before it broke through. But the fact that government entities are treating ultra-processed food the way they treated tobacco is significant. It's an acknowledgement that this isn't about personal responsibility. It's about corporate behavior that prioritizes profit over public health. The plantation system took bodies and worked them to death for sugar. The modern system takes the same substance and uses it to work bodies toward chronic disease and early death. Different mechanisms, same result. And the people profiting, shareholders in food and beverage companies, executives collecting bonuses, are as distant from the consequences as plantation owners who never saw the fields where people died making their fortunes. This is what sugar does now. It doesn't need whips and chains. It just needs to be cheap, everywhere, engineered for maximum consumption, and marketed so constantly that refusing it feels abnormal. The death happens more slowly than it did in the cane fields. But it's still happening, and it's still making some people rich while breaking other people's bodies. So where does this leave us? We know the history: luxury to obsession, plantations to empires, hidden ingredient to health crisis. We know the scale: 853 million diabetics by 2050, obesity rates climbing, children developing diseases that were once rare in adults. We know who profits and who pays. What we don't know is whether anything can actually change. Let's be honest about the obstacles first, because pretending this is simple doesn't help anyone. Sugar is embedded in the global food system at every level. Governments subsidize sugar production because it's politically important. Sugarcane and sugar beet farmers vote, and agricultural subsidies keep them politically aligned. Food manufacturers depend on sugar because it's cheap, versatile, and drives consumption of their products. Retailers profit from sugar-laden products with long shelf lives and high turnover. And consumers are physiologically and psychologically habituated to high sugar diets from childhood. Changing this means fighting against trillion-dollar industries, against government policies designed to protect agricultural interests, against cultural habits that span generations, and against brain chemistry that makes sugar consumption genuinely rewarding and hard to resist. Personal willpower doesn't work against this level of systemic design. If it did, we wouldn't have an epidemic. So what actually works? What evidence do we have that change is possible? Start with policy interventions, because those are the tools that can shift systems rather than just asking individuals to make harder choices. Sugar-sweetened beverage taxes have been implemented in over 50 countries and jurisdictions, and the evidence is clear. They work. When Mexico implemented a soda tax in 2014, consumption dropped by about 6% overall and up to 12% in the poorest households who are most affected by diabetes. The UK's soft drinks industry levy, implemented in 2018, led to a 30% reduction in sugar content in drinks as manufacturers reformulated to avoid the tax. These taxes do double duty. They reduce consumption through price effects, and they generate revenue that can be used for public health programs. They also send a signal that sugar overconsumption is a public health issue, not just a personal choice, which helps shift cultural norms. Warning labels work too. Chile implemented strict front-of-package warning labels in 2016 for products high in sugar, sodium, saturated fat, or calories. The labels look like stop signs, black octagons that say high in sugar or high in calories. Combined with restrictions on marketing to children and bans on selling such products in schools, Chile's seen significant reductions in purchase of labeled products and increased consumption of healthier alternatives. Other Latin American countries are following Chile's model. Marketing restrictions help protect children specifically. Quebec banned fast food advertising to children under 13 in the 1980s, and studies show this led to reduced fast food consumption and lower childhood obesity rates compared to other Canadian provinces. Sweden, Norway, and several other countries have similar restrictions. The evidence is consistent. When you stop bombarding children with junk food advertising, they eat less junk food. This shouldn't be surprising, but industries fight these restrictions fiercely because creating lifelong consumers starting in childhood is central to their business model. School food programs can make a difference if they're actually funded and implemented well. Countries and districts that have eliminated soda and junk food from schools improved school lunch quality and provided nutrition education see benefits. But this requires political will and money, things that are often lacking in the jurisdictions where kids need them most. Subsidies could be restructured. Right now, many governments subsidize production of corn, which becomes high fructose corn syrup, and sugar, while doing little to nothing to subsidize vegetables and fruits. Flip that. Tax sugar, subsidize produce, and you change the economics of healthy eating. But agriculture lobbies fight this because it threatens their business models. There's also the medical approach, treating sugar overconsumption and ultra-processed food as addiction in some cases, providing behavioral interventions and support similar to other substance dependencies. This is controversial because calling sugar addictive in the clinical sense is debated, but the overlap in brain responses to sugar and drugs is real enough that addiction model interventions help some people. And there are individual strategies that work for some people in some circumstances. Cooking from scratch gives you control over sugar content. Reading labels and choosing products with less added sugar reduces intake. Replacing soda with water makes a huge difference. Not keeping junk food in the house reduces temptation. These strategies require time, knowledge, and access to alternatives, privileges that not everyone has. But for those who can implement them, they help. But here's where we need to be realistic. Individual strategies and voluntary industry action haven't solved this problem and won't. We have decades of evidence that asking people to make better choices in a food environment designed to promote bad choices doesn't work at population scale. Obesity and diabetes rates have continued rising despite endless public health campaigns about healthy eating, despite fitness trends, despite the diet industry, despite millions of individuals trying and often failing to change their consumption patterns. The problem is structural, so the solution has to be structural. That means regulation that food companies will fight. It means spending government money on programs that politicians don't want to fund. It means confronting agricultural interests that have outsized political influence. It means telling people that their favorite foods are harmful, which is unpopular. It means making processed food more expensive or less available, which feels paternalistic and gets framed as attacking freedom. But we've done this before with other products. Tobacco was everywhere, heavily advertised, socially normal, and seemingly impossible to regulate. Then governments started restricting advertising, adding warning labels, taxing cigarettes, banning smoking in public places, and funding cessation programs. Smoking rates dropped dramatically. It took decades and constant political fights, but it worked. Leaded gasoline was entrenched in the economy, defended by industries claiming it was necessary, and fought every regulation attempt. It was eventually phased out worldwide because the evidence of harm became undeniable, and governments decided protecting public health mattered more than protecting industry profits. Sugar is harder in some ways because it's a nutrient in appropriate amounts. We need some carbohydrates to live, whereas tobacco and lead have no beneficial function. But added sugars in ultra-processed foods aren't nutrition. They're industrial ingredients designed for corporate profit, and we can treat them accordingly. The other factor that might drive change is economic. Diabetes and obesity are costing economies trillions in healthcare spending and lost productivity. At some point, those costs become unsustainable, even for wealthy countries. When government budgets are being consumed by managing preventable chronic diseases, when workforces are disabled by conditions that didn't need to happen, when military readiness is compromised because too many young adults are too unhealthy to serve, that might create pressure for policy changes that improve the food environment. It's a grim calculation that we might only get serious about preventing disease when it becomes too expensive to keep treating it. But it's also realistic about how policy changes happen. They usually come when maintaining the status quo becomes more costly or politically difficult than reform. So can we escape sugar's grip? Yes, but only if we treat it like the system-level problem it is. That means regulation over voluntary action, structural change over individual responsibility, and long-term commitment over quick fixes. It means accepting that foods engineered for addiction should be regulated like other addictive products. It means deciding that public health matters more than food industry profits. It's possible. The question is whether we'll do it in time to prevent 853 million diabetes cases by 2050, or whether we'll watch the numbers climb while industries insist on personal responsibility and governments do nothing that might upset corporate donors. The plantation owners didn't stop slavery because it was wrong. They stopped when economic forces and political pressure made continuing it untenable. The sugar crisis won't end because companies suddenly prioritize health. It'll end when regulation forces them to, when taxes make healthy options cheaper than junk, when marketing to children is banned, and when governments decide that a population dying of preventable disease is no longer acceptable. We have the knowledge. We have examples of policies that work. What we need is the political will to implement them against fierce opposition from industries that are currently profiting from sickness. Sugar-built empires. Let's be clear about that. The wealth of Britain, France, the Netherlands, significant portions came from sugar and the slave trade that produced it. The banking systems, the insurance markets, the shipping industries, the capital that funded the Industrial Revolution, sugar profits helped build all of it. The cost was millions of African lives, consumed in Caribbean fields, their bodies treated as fuel for sweetness. When the chains came off, the sugar didn't stop flowing. The system evolved: indentured labor, debt peonage, wage exploitation. But the basic relationship remained: people with power extracting value from people without power, using sugar as the medium. And now, in the 21st century, sugar is everywhere. It's in your coffee, it's in your ketchup, it's in products labeled healthy. It's engineered into ultra-processed foods designed to override your satiety signals and keep you consuming. And the bodies breaking down now aren't in the cane fields. They're in diabetes clinics, in cardiac wards, in morgues where people die decades before they should, from diseases that were rare a generation ago. The WHO warns that 1 in 8 adults globally will have diabetes by 2050. That's 853 million people managing a chronic disease that affects every system in the body, that leads to amputations and blindness and kidney failure and heart disease. That's millions dying early because the food environment they live in is designed to maximize consumption and profit rather than health. The plantation owners got rich selling sugar. The food companies are getting rich selling products that slowly poison their customers. Different centuries, same extraction, same indifference to human cost. But here's the thing about systems. They can change. Tobacco went from ubiquitous to restricted. Lead was removed from gasoline, despite industry claiming it was impossible. Slavery itself, which once seemed permanent and necessary to entire economies, was abolished. Not easily, not without decades of struggle, but it happened because people decided the cost was too high and fought until the system changed. Sugar isn't going to disappear. We don't need it to. But we need to stop treating it like it's harmless, stop allowing companies to engineer food for addiction, stop marketing junk to children, stop subsidizing sugar while making vegetables expensive. Stop acting like this is about personal responsibility when the entire food system is designed to promote overconsumption. We can tax sugar-sweetened beverages. We can require clear warning labels. We can ban marketing to kids. We can remove junk food from schools. We can subsidize produce instead of corn syrup. We can treat ultra-processed food companies the way we treated tobacco, as corporations prioritizing profit over public health, deserving of regulation and restriction, and yes, lawsuits. This will require political courage that's currently scarce. It'll require fighting industries with billions to spend on lobbying and propaganda. It'll require accepting that some changes will be unpopular because people are attached to foods they've consumed since childhood. But the alternative is watching diabetes rates climb, watching obesity rates increase, watching preventable disease consume healthcare budgets, and shorten lives while pretending there's nothing systemic we can do. Sugar didn't have to become a global health crisis. It became one because profit mattered more than health, because convenience mattered more than consequences, and because systems designed to extract value from people treated human well-being as externality to be ignored. The same powder that built empires on slave labor is now helping to kill 38 million people a year from non-communicable diseases. We don't chain people in fields anymore. We've found more efficient ways to extract value from bodies. The sweetness hasn't changed. The suffering hasn't stopped. If this investigation into sugar's history, from medieval luxury to plantation nightmare to modern epidemic, changed how you think about what's in your food and who profits from your consumption, I'd appreciate if you subscribed. There are more stories like this, more systems designed to extract wealth while externalizing harm, more uncomfortable truths that need telling. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to the whole story, not just the sweet parts. And maybe, before you reach for that next soda or processed snack, think about what that sweetness actually costs.